again to introduce myself. I'm Chris Lele of Target Test Prep, and I will be walking us through a sentence equivalence workshop. So hopefully you're in the right place. Here we go. This up just a little bit. And can everyone see where it says the new press secretary quickly became known for her deft use of circumlocution? Everyone good? All righty. This here is a text completion. Now you can put this in the chat, but definitely just for your own edification, think to yourself, what is different about this question than your average text completion? There are two things, superficially at least, if we just look at this, that make it different. The first one is that there are 6 answer choices, not 5. And the second, and again, a superficial thing, is they are not in parentheses. And this is maybe something that's difficult to remember if you're not that familiar with these question types. But let me just draw on my little thing here. But notice right there. See that? Those are brackets, not parentheses. And so what those brackets mean, and this pertains to the math section as well, is that there is more than one correct answer. With sentence equivalence questions, there is always 2. There are always 2 correct answers. So 2 out of 6. And that makes it a different kind of animal. Now, it goes a little deeper than that, because what's also something we can see is that these words, these 2 answer choices, have to be synonyms. That is very similar words. You look them up in the thesaurus, they're listed next to each other, pretty close in meaning. Maybe not exactly the same, but they create equivalent sentences. So hence the name of this question type. So again, there'll be 2 answers and they will be very similar. Now, what we also often see, though, is that there are other pairs of synonyms also amongst the 6 answer choices. So for instance, if we don't even look at this question and we just look at those 6 answer choices, something that jumps out at me is that first answer choice, inept, answer choice A, and answer choice E, incompetent. Those are similar words. Somebody who's inept is just bad at things. They're not competent. So pretty much a very clear synonym with incompetent. Then I look at some of the other words. I see frank and blunt. Blunt is a more common word. Frank is maybe on that border of being a GRE vocabulary word and maybe not quite, but they're both very similar. They mean when you speak directly. So just off the bat, you can see, there are 2 pairs of answer choices that are synonyms. Now, if your vocabulary is a little bit stronger, you've been working on these GRE vocabulary flashcards, you might have come across answer choice B, which is the word adroit. Adroit, proficient, answer choice D. So what you have in this specific question, in this specific sentence completion, are 3 pairs of synonyms. So all of a sudden, now it's no longer like a 1 in 15 chance. And the reason I say that is out of 2 possible answer choices, if there's 6 to choose from, using a little bit of combinations math here, that's actually a total of 15 answer choice possibilities. All of a sudden, if you have a pretty strong vocabulary, you can make this a 1 out of 3 question. An important side note here is not all sentence equivalence questions. In fact, the majority do not have 3 pairs of synonyms. The majority have 2 pairs of synonyms. And you know the other 2 answer choices can't be correct because they wouldn't create equivalent sentences. So depending on how many words you know in the sentence, and assuming you know them all, you can suddenly make this a 50-50 question without even reading the question stem up here where it says the new press secretary at all. Which is a pretty cool thing that's really going to inform our strategy today. And of course, your strategy when you're taking the actual test or taking practice tests. Now that we've gone over what makes these questions distinct, what makes them similar to the text completions that we talked about? Well, this question stem at the top here, this one right there, I've seen on the GRE before, questions that are in official materials show up on test day that are sentence equivalence questions I recognize, but have actually been turned into text completion questions, meaning that this question stem, the sentence at the top is the exact same. They just change it to 5 answer choices and use parentheses and not brackets. So the general strategy we use for those is going to be the same. And that is we read the entire sentence, not getting tripped up by words like circumlocution and thinking, oh my God, I don't know what that means. I'm not going to get this right. What can it mean? You can just read right past it, and we're going to do that now. The new press secretary quickly became known for her deft use. I'm going to underline that word deft. Her predecessor, after the semicolon now I'm reading, her predecessor had been far less blank in evading pointed questions. So I read the entire sentence. I then go back and I look for clues that are important. I see deft, which means skillful. And another important clue here is that word predecessor. It might not jump out to you at first as to why this is important, but there's a common type of change in direction of a sentence, meaning it starts off saying one thing about a person or a thing, and then it changes direction. Here, that change in direction is around time. We have a new press secretary, and we're comparing her to her predecessor, someone who came before. And so you are going to have now a contrast between her being deft and her predecessor, who had been far less blank in evading pointed questions. And at that point, you want to come up with your own word for the blank. And I think the word deft or skillful would work pretty well here. And then that will get us to the right answers. So even if you don't know what adroit means, if you know deft means skillful, you're able to go and eliminate those pairs like inept and incompetent, which don't mean skillful, and blunt and frank, which don't really mean skillful or the opposite at all. And you can circle B and D to get the correct answer, as we will do here. So those are our answers. Really quickly, before we go on to the next question, you might want to note that word circumlocution is a great example of how roots can help you. Circum means around, like think of a circle around a circle, and locu is the root for to speak. So if somebody's is speaking in circles, they're not speaking directly. They're beating around the bush. So that's a good word to know, but again, we didn't even have to know it to get the right answer. Alrighty, let's go on now to the next question in this batch. Gonna scroll down here. Okay. Now with this question, the strategy here is going to be a little bit different. You might notice that this question is really long. It has words like notwithstanding that can definitely throw students off. It can be a little bit confusing. Now, I want you to imagine yourself in the testing room itself, and you're running out of time. Minutes going, clicking down. You have like 57 seconds, 56 seconds. Oh my gosh, what are you going to do? And this is the last question. Do you read the entire thing and try to make heads or tails of it? Now, if it were a text completion question, the answer is probably. Otherwise, how would I know what the answer was? And that is very true. But on sentence equivalence questions, you can actually ignore the question completely, especially a long question like this, especially when you're running out of time. And that way, you can look just at the answer choices because we know something about those answer choices. The correct answers, the two words that are the answers, have to be synonyms. So we ignore this for a moment. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to some little steps below, ignore those for a second. And I want you to look at those synonyms and think to yourself, which ones are pairs? And if you want to, you can even put that in the chat and see what you think. So I'll give you about 30 seconds here. Good. I'm seeing A and F. A and F, those are definitely synonyms. Great. Any others? I'm getting B and D. C and E. Okay, great. I think people are really nailing these this morning. So we see the words that they could be. And so we know it has to be one of those three. So now that time is ticking, you have 28 seconds left. At least you've made this a 1 out of 3 question. I will, though, push back just a little bit because I realize when we say synonyms, sometimes it can be a little bit fuzzy. Exactly what do we mean? So flourished and prospered are pretty much synonyms. It's hard to think of a sentence in which one wouldn't apply to the other, right? The same goes for languished and deteriorated. And I know languished is a little bit more difficult, kind of that GRE vocabulary word. So let's leave those alone for a second. But let's look at reconfigured and diverge. When you reconfigure something, maybe let's think of your laptop screen. You just kind of move things around, right? But when you diverge, you go in a totally different direction. So think of two people walking down the road and they diverge. They go totally different areas. So not quite the same as reconfigure, where you're just mixing up the existing elements, not having them split apart. And so if you pick up on that, in those 57 seconds remaining, you've made this a 50-50 question. Now there's one other interesting thing. Notice here that the pairs flourished and prospered, and that word deteriorated. If assuming you don't know language, those words are opposite. If something's prospering, it's doing well. If it's flourishing, it's doing well. But if something is deteriorating, it's coming apart. And so it's not just that the remaining words are two pairs of synonyms, but they're two pairs of opposite synonyms. And so now you can go back here and basically ask yourself, is what goes in this blank a positive word like flourish or a negative word like deteriorate? And so let's take about 30 seconds or so and read the sentence. Great. Seems like a few of you are getting the correct answer. I'm going to go through here really quickly and read this and kind of show you what's happening in my brain while I read through the sentence. And I'm going to assume that I'm not as comfortable with certain words that most people aren't comfortable with in general. And there's one in there that really jumps out. So let's read it in my head. Following the golden age of Mexican cinema in the mid 20th century, the film industry in Mexico, so I'm reading and I saw golden age, so following it. Okay, so following a golden age, maybe there's going to be some kind of time shift here, but we don't know. We haven't really seen what follows. It says, notwithstanding the release of numerous cult favorites. Notwithstanding, that word, it's one of those transition words. It's very academic sounding, and it's sometimes hard to remember what it is. So at that point, do you rack your brain trying to remember it? No, you read on because there's a lot going on in the second part of the sentence, and that's probably going to tell us what the blank is. It was not until the 1990s, and I think, oh, there's a time change in here. It's golden age, mid 20th century, now 1990s. Well, what's going on in the 90s? It says here, Mexican filmmaking experienced a revival. And then I underline that part that says revival right over here, which is great because I know now that the blank is the opposite because of that time change from revival. So I have to pick the negative words. I'm not picking flourished and prospered. I'm picking languished and deteriorated. Answer choice C and D. Let me X that out. And here we go. So there we have it. Those are the steps that I followed to be able to get to this point. Now, I'm going to walk us through these steps a little bit just so we can codify this, kind of embed this a little bit in our memories and into our processes. So the first one is to read the entire sentence. Second one is to look for clues in the sentence the way we did with revival. Come up with your own word. We didn't quite do this at this time because we were just looking for positive and negatives. And then number 4, determine whether a blank is positive or negative. Now, this is if you are not limited on time and there's 40 or 50 seconds to go. And if you are not completely flummoxed or confused by the sentence, which can oftentimes happen. Those are the 4 standard steps. But if you are confused by the sentence and there's limited time, then let's jump to number 6 here. We looked at the answer choices. We looked for pairs of synonyms. We also look for pairs of synonyms that are opposites, because those are typically one of those is going to be the answer choices. And so that gets it closer to a 50-50. The final step there is if you're completely confused by what's going on, sometimes working backwards and putting those words back into the sentence and trying to figure out what's going on, or just thinking, is that blank positive or negative? And what are these 2 remaining pairs? And again, that's typically on a really hard question. And I do have a couple of those today in this webinar, so definitely keep that strategy in mind. Okay, let us now move to something else that's kind of interesting. So a minute ago, we talked about synonyms. That's pretty bullish on how there's synonyms here. Look for the synonyms. And I think that is a great strategy, like 90% of the time. That's what you want to do. However, there are these outliers. Maybe it's 7%, maybe it's 10%, but it's something low. And the words aren't exactly synonyms. They're not completely different words, but they're close enough that they create similar sentences. So let's take a look here at the following question here with the chef's presentation. If you're to just go through here, and actually I take that back. That is the following question. So this question, actually, what we're going to do, so we're not going to look for words that aren't quite synonyms. That's going to come next. What we're going to do with this question is we're going to apply the strategies that we learned above in 1 through 10, however you want to use them. And I'm going to give you guys about 45 seconds to a minute to answer this question and see how you do using these strategies. So you can begin now. Okay, I think I got everyone. Most of you have had a chance to answer that. I think everyone got that correct, I believe. So great job. Here, you can read the sentence. If you look at the clue, stark white plate, just 3 ingredients, you know that the presentation is more simple and it's contrasted with the though at the beginning, which shows there's a change from the daring flavor combinations. And so that leads us to answer choice A and E. If you were not sure what the sentence was saying, or again, you were maybe on very limited time in a hypothetical scenario, you could look at A and E as matching together, ornate and elaborate as matching together, and chaotic and cluttered as matching together, and then work backwards from that. But it sounds like you all got that, so we're doing a great job here. Good job. Let us now go to the following question. And this was the question I kind of jumped the gun there a second ago, where there are 6 answer choices, and the answers choices, the correct ones, aren't necessarily synonyms. And the reason I'm showing you this question is this sometimes happens on the GRE sentence equivalence, where they're not quite synonyms, but they're still the answer choices because they create similar sentences. And it's almost like, to use an analogy, synonyms are next door neighbors. And in instances like this, where they're not quite synonyms, it's like the neighbor down the road a few houses. So it's not like, oh, this person lives in a different neighborhood. That would be something that's the opposite or has no connection to the word. So it's similar-ish. So with that said, let's take apart this sentence together. I'll walk you through it and then see which words you think work. So under new leadership, the DA's office has been far more blank in investigating financial fraud at the highest echelons or levels of business, filing a flurry of charges in the last few months. So I see that clue there. They are filing a flurry. A flurry is a lot. Like when there's a snowstorm and there's a flurry, all these snowflakes are falling. So they're very gung-ho, let's just say, on filing these charges. Okay, with that in mind, try going through the answer choices and seeing which ones work. And you can also, again, put that in the chat screen when you're done. Okay, it looks like most of you have had time to work through there. I think once we have the sentence there, I kind of gave you my own word, which was gung-ho, which is very eager to do something. But again, that's always a great strategy. Try that on your own and then match it with those words. In doing so, we're going to get zealous and aggressive, answer choices A and D. Now, can you create a sentence in which zealous and aggressive are not quite the same? And the answer is yes. And so for that reason, they're not quite synonyms, but they also do exist, again, in the same neighborhood, just a little bit down the street. So there are examples where someone can be zealous about something kind of over the top. They're doing it aggressively, and that's close enough. The trap answer here is indiscriminate. When you do indiscriminate, you do it in a way where you're not really paying attention. And if you do something indiscriminately and you're just, for instance, going after people and filing charges, if you do that indiscriminately, then that could lead to a filing a flurry of charges. But here, there's nothing to suggest that the DA's office is being indiscriminate and just going after everyone. They're specifically going after financial fraud. Okay, with that said, I'm happy that I chose some hard questions at the end because I think a lot of you are getting these right and you're going through these pretty quickly. So let's scroll down here. I have for you the steps just so that they're there. And we are going to do two questions. The first question is where it says Coppola's film. And in this case, I'm going to let you try it again, give you about a minute or so and put your answers in the chat. Oh, can I scroll up? Like that up? Or up like this. Let me see. I definitely want to make sure everyone's seeing what I see. Here we go. I'm just going to separate this so we don't get distracted. Oops, a daisy. Oops, my apologies. Looks like my enter button got stuck there for a moment, but okay. There we go. Okay. So let's go through this one. I'm going to assume that it's a little tricky and you might not know which ones to pick. So let's read it. Coppola's film, blank despite its brevity, offers a refreshing response to the dizzying paced overlong sagas. So you think, okay, well, overlong seems to be a clue, but it already says blank despite its brevity. So the contrast seems to be there, overlong and brevity. So that's interesting. Huh. What should I do? So at this point, again, you can look at the answers and break them into pairs. What jumps out at me is fleeting and transient. That means not lasting a long time. Erratic and fickle, I pause on that a little bit. Someone's fickle is likely to kind of change their tastes or preferences. They're kind of hard to pin down, changes their mind right away. And then erratic is kind of like fickle, but it seems a lot more extreme. If someone's erratic, they're completely unpredictable. Someone's fickle, they can change their mind here and there. So those I don't necessarily think are going to be the answers. And then I get leisurely and languid. I think of leisurely kind of this mellow stroll down the road. I think languid is lazy. It's a GRE word, so it's not a word that people, just use every day. But someone's languid is they really lack that energy. They just don't want to get out of bed. Maybe they have a cold. Or leisurely, again, has a slightly different flavor to it. So my brain says, oh, it must be fleeting and transient, B and D. But then I go back to the sentence and I put those words in there. Coppola's film fleeting despite its brevity. Well, brevity is fleeting. Fleeting despite being fleeting doesn't make sense. And so that method didn't work quite as well, but it's helped me eliminate at least fleeting and transient. But now I read the sentence again and I go back where it says a refreshing response to the dizzying pace. So something it's doing is in contrast to dizzying pace. And then that jumps out at me. Now, if that jumped out at you the first time you got it, that's excellent. But sometimes with harder questions like that, that doesn't always happen. So dizzying pace, the opposite of something that makes you feel dizzy. Everything's happening in the comic book movie. Things are going all over the place. What's the opposite of that? I look back at the answer choices. Erratic. Nope, that is not the opposite. Then I look at leisurely and I say, yeah, I mean, like a leisurely paced movie. It's a short movie, but it's not really fast like most movies. And I pick leisurely. And then I look down at languid and I think, aha, it's close-ish. And this is one of those, 7 to 10% of questions, like the one we just did with the DA's office, where the words aren't quite exactly synonyms. And that's why, again, this is a hard question. We had to apply those 10 rules and they didn't quite work. And 100%, that's why I have to go back and play around with it just a little bit. But as long as we keep our cool and keep that focus going back between the answer choices and those word stem or the sentence itself, we can get the correct answer. And again, that correct answer is, let me bring out my little pen here, is going to be leisurely and languid. So again, not quite the same words, but both of them, more generally speaking, mean you're taking it slow. And so in that semantic neighborhood, taking it slow, both of those words work, and those are our answers. All righty, if you got that right, great job. If not, don't worry, because this is a hard question. I imagine this showing up in the harder verbal section. So to give you a little context of what I mean there, when you take the GRE, you get a medium first section, and depending on how well you do on that, you get one of three other sections: another medium section, an easier section, or a hard section. And it's typically on the hard section where you would see something like this. Now we have one more question, the one that kind of disappeared below, which is even harder. And it's sort of like the challenge question. I mean, you might see something of this difficulty on the day of the test. So let's scroll down. Second, and here we go. I get it, kind of very down here. So definitely, there we go. Okay, I'm going to give you a whole 2.5 minutes to try to solve this one. And again, when you do, put your answer choices in the chat. All righty, looks like most of you has had a chance, and you guys did really well today. You all did a fantastic job. Not everyone got this one correct, but the fact that quite a few of you did is very impressive. And I think a lot of you have obviously have a strong vocabulary, and it looks like a strong grasp of the sentence equivalence question. But let's walk through this one together and see what makes it so difficult. Although the committee was commended for identifying most major errors. I read that. I know there's going to be a change here between the part that comes before the comma that begins with although and the part that comes after. So they were commended, but you know now something negative is going to happen after the comma. And indeed, it says frequently criticized. So right away, my brain says, okay, negative word. But I have to read on. As it often failed to capture minor but important details. Okay, so it didn't capture these specifics. I mean, they're minor specifics. And then it also says, and occasionally overlooked less obvious yet significant inaccuracies. So it sounds like this committee is good at capturing most stuff. If something is significantly inaccurate, it's probably going to catch it most of the time. It does, of course, say it occasionally overlooks those. But what it's not good at doing is capturing those minor details. And now I look at the answer choices and I think to myself, well, I don't really know a word. That means you don't capture the minor details, but you capture usually the major ones. But I have an idea at least of what I'm going for. And I also know that using the strategies of pairing synonyms together can help me, especially the stronger my vocabulary is. So I start with scrupulous. If you're scrupulous, you are doing something in an exacting way where you are looking at the details, looking at something very carefully, you're scrutinizing it. So that sounds like it would work, right? But that's the rub with this one. That's a trap because it says it failed to capture the important details. If it was scrupulous, it would not have failed to grab those. It's good at the bigger things, but not the smaller things. So A doesn't work. What about lenient? Well, it's lenient. Sure, it failed to capture minor important details because it was lenient, but it was commended, praised for getting most major errors. That's what it was good at. So leniency would just make it a mess across the board. They would be criticized for missing most things, major and minor. So it can't be that one. Then I get to see perfunctory. Now let's just assume I don't quite know this word. Maybe I've seen it before, but in the moment I can't quite grasp the meaning, which is fine. I'm going to go on to another answer choice. I see biased. Interesting. So biased. Its review process was frequently seen as biased. Could it be biased in capturing just the major errors, but not the minor ones? So it's a certain bias towards not being detailed? I don't know. But again, I have to find a matching word. E, fastidious. Now this, unlike perfunctory, which is a harder GRE vocabulary word, it's just not as common. I feel fastidious comes up quite a bit. It's in the neighborhood with meticulous. Someone is meticulous, they are paying attention to detail. They are thorough. If someone's fastidious, they're even more so. So it has almost slightly negative or at least a very detail-orientated connotation to it, which sounds like, again, the opposite of what we're going for here because they're missing these minor details. So again, A and E, you could put those together, pair them, but they're not the meaning we're going for. And then that leaves us with lackadaisical. Lackadaisical is a word you might know offhand, or it could be a word you've encountered in GRE vocabulary lists. If you're lackadaisical, kind of lacking the energy or the motivation, you're just kind of going through the motions. And I think to myself, if you're lackadaisical, you might get the major errors, but you're definitely going to miss the minor errors. You're just kind of dialing it in. But again, you're also sometimes overlooking major inaccuracies or major issues or major inaccuracies. So sure, that could work. And so then I look back at that word perfunctory and I say, well, perfunctory either means something similar to lackadaisical or to biased. And the biased one, at least when I was doing it logically, I felt it was more of a reach. sure you're more biased to major errors than minor errors, but that's not really what it's going for. That's seems a little loosey-goosey there. The idea is that you are missing these important details. There's something about your character that you're leading you to miss these really specific things. Is being lackadaisical, could that do it? For sure. So you could capture the big things if you're being a little bit lackadaisical, but you're missing the small things. So perfunctory, therefore, must be a synonym or at least a very similar word to lackadaisical. And therein are the two answers, C and F. Perfunctory, the exact definition is exactly that. You go through the motions. You don't really put your heart and soul into it. So C and F. Now, out of curiosity, of those who got that correct, who did not know the word perfunctory? Maybe you can do a little nod along, or I can't see many of you, but hopefully, perhaps a few of you, because I always like, oh, someone is going to wants to come in and start annotating now. So let me just make sure I can circle the answers here too. Awesome. Cool. So as I talk through that, it looks like someone has annotated there. I forgot who that was, but thank you so much for doing that as I talked through that. So as I said, if you didn't know that word perfunctory, and I'll circle the answers. Oops, I did use the wrong color pen. Perfunctory and then lackadaisical. I'll just put the red there so it's a little bit clearer. But anyway, there we can see the correct answer choices, C and F. So the reason I ask if someone didn't know the perfunctory is I think being able to navigate around words you don't know, which can oftentimes happen on test day, is a very important skill. And I think the steps that we went over today can help you do this on the sentence equivalence section. So I will stop there now, and I'm going to give it back to you all for questions. So we'll have an open Q&A session, and I'm going to stop sharing. Oh, somehow, my apologies. Let me just clear this off. Okay, great. So yeah, you can either do a Q&A in the chat, or you can come off mute and let me know if you have any questions.